Welcome back to Special Reports. Now that President Trump has been elected, the fate of more than 1,000 Americans who were charged with crimes related to breaching the U.S. Capitol during the January 6th riots comes into question. Trump has said that he's inclined to pardon many of them, calling them patriots.
Now, many are requesting delays for their cases, waiting to see what Trump will do after he is inaugurated. Joining us now to discuss is January 6th defendant Tim Hale. Tim, thanks for speaking with us today.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I'm happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so Tim, you were released from jail earlier this year after spending 3 years incarcerated for nonviolent offenses on January 6th. So tell us a little bit about your time locked up.
Oh, that was it was very interesting. For those that don't know, in 2021, I know it was a long time ago, but that was at the height of COVID. So they denied a lot of us bonds. They had basically smeared us as domestic terrorists so they could deny us bail, our constitutional right. So they actually sent us to this jail in Washington, D.C. They called it the D.C. Gulag because it was an absolute dump. And they kept us in pretrial detention, and they had us in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day. So they were able to do this because of COVID. So those who were on the, in blue states like California, New York, New Jersey, you probably remember those days. DC was worse than any of those deep blue states. And so that's what it was like for about a year in there. And then, of course, we were denied our right to a fair and speedy trial. So I spent 16 months, a year and a half, waiting to go to trial while I was locked in solitary. There were horrendous conditions. Now, it's sort of a, I'm not going to say it's a micro. It's a small, selection. I mean, not everybody who was charged for January 6th ended up going to that specific jail. There were people housed in other jails. People were housed in prisons, and not everybody has the same story. But the long and short of it is that people's constitutional rights were deprived. I wasn't allowed to receive communion. You weren't allowed to see your family. You weren't allowed to see your lawyer half the time. Marjorie Taylor Greene, in the summer of 2021, she tried to come into the jail to inspect the conditions, and they turned her away. The same day, they also turned my lawyer away. So basically every civil liberty you hold sacred in the Constitution, whether it's the Bill of Rights or it's the 14th Amendment, was pretty much denied to us. And it was denied because of COVID or just simply because the wardens didn't like us. The wardens there, actually, it's funny enough, their social media showed that they hated Trump and they hated Trump supporters. We were treated completely we were treated wrongly, and it was completely vindictive. They deprived us of our rights as Americans, and they've been doing that to everyone, even if they weren't in jail. So I want people to understand that this was a horrible precedent they set. We have a common law system, and it's a great system. But if you look at Roe v. Wade, or if you look at Plessy v. Ferguson, bad precedents can take decades or generations to reverse. So we can't let this ever happen again.
Well, that's a good point. So speaking of precedent, hundreds of more defendants are awaiting sentencing. So what do you hope to see President Trump do once he takes office? Is there any precedent can be changed?
This is an important topic that I think people don't even think about as in depth as they should. A lot of people just want to jump to pardons, and I look forward to pardons. But the first thing that I hope that the new administration does is end the prosecutions, because they're still charging people. They're still hunting people down. They're still kicking in doors. And I think they need to stop doing that. They also need to, I think they need to give clemency to the people who are currently incarcerated. I have friends who are I got lucky. I got a 4-year sentence for walking through the building, but I have friends of mine who are doing 14 years or 12 years. So, I mean, these people are rotting in prison. And I think the first thing that they should do is commute their sentences, release them, and then work on the pardons. And then, there are other ways that they can make us whole. But, my initial hope is that they will stop the weaponization of law enforcement, and they'll stop hunting people down, because, like I said, and as you acknowledge, it's a precedent. The pendulum can always swing back in the other direction. And I don't want this to happen to the left either. I don't want the weaponization of law or against political opponents. So hopefully this stops on day one, and then, the pardons, they can look at that after. But the main thing to me is that they let these people out to give these people their freedom. The liberation comes before the vindication, as far as I'm concerned.
Tim, I just want to clarify, your friends that are serving 12, 14 years, what are they being accused of here?
It varies. It varies. So again, they're all about narratives. In one instance, I have one of the Oath Keepers I was with, Kelly Meggs. Just because he was one of the Oath Keepers, they gave him an egregious sentence. He had a judge named Amit Mehta, and he was one of the most partisan Obama loyalists involved in all the January 6 cases. For those that don't know, January 6 cases have basically all been dealt with by like 20 judges, and they're all extremely biased and extremely cruel. And Mehta was one of the cruelest. So the Oath Keepers got extremely high sentences. Some are probably more aware of the Proud Boys, how some of them got like 20 years, but the same was done to the Oath Keepers. And they were actually there to protect cops. They actually protected Officer Harry Dunn, who then lied under oath to get them convicted at trial. And he ran for office in Maryland or something like that. I mean, it's egregious. You have a man, Tom Webster. He got sentenced to 10 years for assaulting a cop, but then they withheld the video that showed that the cop hit him first and he was defending himself. And there are a lot of due process violations, Brady violations, the American public just doesn't know about. But I'm glad that they know about Ray Epps. I'm glad that they know that there was infiltration in the crowd. There were feds, there were provocateurs, but there's so much that's been withheld from the public. And the fact that this is still going on 3 years, 4 years later, I hope that when President Trump gets back in, I hope they finally release all the video that's been withheld from the public. And I hope that people are made whole, because when you deprive people rights and here's another example. Julian Cater was accused of murdering Officer Brian Sicknick. That was absolutely not true. And then he was forced into a plea deal and he's serving over 7 years in prison. That man's I was smeared as a neo-Nazi and I was actually a comedian, but that man was smeared as a cop killer. He's going to be called a cop murderer for the rest of his life. He deserves restitution for that, and he shouldn't be in prison. And so you have a lot of good men who are locked up because of circumstances that were out of their control. Either they defended themselves and they were accused of being violent, or you have people who were accused of being part of far right. In the case of the Proud Boys or the Oath Keepers, they were accused of seditious conspiracy. I mean, these are made up charges that rely on innuendo more than anything else. And so we just have to stop the prosecutions and let these people out, because they were completely smeared, they were railroaded, and they never had a chance. That's why they did to President Trump what they did to him too. They charged him in D.C. because they knew he couldn't get a fair trial with a fair jury. It's extremely biased. They deny change of venue, and it's completely rigged. And that was true for us. It was true for Trump, and it's going to be true for anybody else in the future who's railroaded like this. So it's a lot. I'm sorry to say, but it's way more convoluted than the public realizes, and it's a tragedy.
Well, on the subject of being convoluted too, do you get the sense at all that when Nancy Pelosi denied those National Guard troops, do you feel that was intentional, number one? And two, how much of this agitation by some of our agencies or outside actors desired this to happen so that someone like yourself would wind up in prison, and many hundreds of others? So
two things. On the issue of Pelosi, we have video now where she's confessed openly that it was her fault for not having the National Guard there. We also have body cameras from Metro PD where they're yelling to each other, "They set us up, they set us up." And so I always point out this is a salient observation. Who's they? Because the Metro PD answered to Mayor Bowser and the Capitol PD answered to Nancy Pelosi. If Trump offered National Guard support, clearly it was an inside job. They wanted this to escalate. The level of intentionality, I mean, that's up for debate. That's why I hope that we get control of the DOJ and we get all the documents. But we know that there were CIA elements that were deployed there that day, the DOJ, BOP. We know that there were DHS assets there. There were Department of Defense assets there. You had every three-letter agency that was there that day. It's obviously an inside job. Myself and other defendants have actually ID'd FBI agents who were in plain clothes there that day. This is in court filings, and even the government has admitted that groups like the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers had dozens of federal informants planted within them. So nothing that happened at the Capitol on January 6th was a surprise. They were following these groups the entire time. We've monitored the CCTV, and you can see that the cameras at the Capitol are moving around, watching and following groups of protesters throughout the day. There was no surprise at the Capitol. They wanted it to happen. But again, the level of infiltration, I would say it's very massive. I myself, when I was incarcerated at the worst point, not the whole time, but at the worst point, about a third of the inmates I was locked up with turned out to be federal informants or Antifa agitators. I was locked up with Zach Alam. He was the Antifa member who broke the window where Ashley Babbitt got shot through the neck. There were communists at the Lower West Terrace Tunnel like Josiah Kenyon. He said he told the feds he wanted to get Trump supporters murdered. There was infiltration. The question is to what degree, but I would suggest it's massive. The video evidence and everything else suggests that this was a massive, massive infiltration job. And we're not even talking about Antifa cells like John Sullivan and the cell that he had on his Discord server. We know that there were federal informants. There was a man named Christopher Cuny. He was being followed by an FBI informant named James Knowles. He infiltrated the Kansas City Proud Boys. This is all on record. This doesn't even get into the stuff
there is certainly a lot of information that needs to be brought to light and needs to be uncovered in regards to January 6th. So thank you for joining our program to tell us more about this today.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
All right. Now coming up on tomorrow's special report.